Hello, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure being here for all of us. Today I'm going to talk really briefly, but hopefully usefully, about what we do and give you a taste of it as well in our philosophical meditation, which is one of our most loved exercises. So first we'll talk about what we do at the School of Life. Then we'll talk about what emotional intelligence is, how we see it at the School of Life. We'll talk about why it's so important at work. And also we'll talk about how we at the School of Life teach emotional intelligence in our classes, in our workshops, in our events, and sort of our technique there. And finally you'll get to try it out, so you'll have a sense of how it works for you, or how one of our exercises works for you in any case. So to start, let me tell you a little bit about what we do at the School of Life. We are a global organization dedicated to developing emotional intelligence. And we have 10 locations around the world, but we operate in even more countries than that. We have, first of all, concrete classrooms where people can go and take workshops and classes on particular emotional topics, as was mentioned. So we teach things like how to make love last, and the meaning of life, and how to fail, or things about how to be calm, how to cope with anxiety. We're teaching the types of skills that you might wish that you had learned in school, but generally aren't covered. And in particular, we're trying to save people a little bit of time and grief, because these are things that otherwise we tend to learn sometimes through really hard experience. So we'd like to save you a little bit of that pain and a little bit of that time learning by doing some thinking up front. You can see here some of the things that we do. That's our classroom in London, in Bloomsbury, and you can always come by. We've also got a storefront in most of our places where you can purchase some of our books and products. Sometimes we have big events, and those are really interesting on different emotional topics. And finally, we've got locations in lots of places, so that's a little map of where our locations are. In particular, we tend to focus our work on two areas of life, and this guy says it even better than we do. This is Sigmund Freud. We're very fond of Freud and of psychotherapy in general. We really believe that it's beneficial for everyone at some point in their life. Freud said of his patients, love and work and love, that's all there is. And by that he meant that on the whole, that was where people came to him to talk about. That was the area in their life where they really needed to explore. And we find it's the same at the School of Life. People come and they want to talk about how to build fulfilling relationships and how to make work fulfilling as well. So over the last 10 years, because we were founded in 2008, we're just hitting our second decade. Over the last 10 years, we've been learning a lot about what people are concerned about at work, what tends to trouble them, what tends to help, what tends to make work go really well. And after a while, people started coming to us and saying, you know that amazing thing that you taught me about listening, or about empathy, or about patience, or about keeping calm? I'd really love to bring it to my office. I'd love to bring it to my team. Can you come in and teach our team that thing? Or can we do an exercise with my whole organization about this, perhaps? So we began to sort of develop our thinking around what people needed in the workplace, and we began to provide services to businesses and organizations. And eventually we decided that roughly there were about 20 things that people really needed to know in order to do well at work in terms of emotional intelligence. These are the ones. And you can see there are lots of different things. So things like adaptability, diplomacy, playfulness, self-awareness, resilience, right? This is more or less the types of things that people need to know in order to do well at work. So we've kind of become experts in this a little bit, hopefully. We also do some other things. These are some other things that we do. We've got a conference that travels about every 6 months. We've got a new location for that. We've got really interesting fun games, cards, books. You can see them upstairs, as was mentioned. And of course, we have our YouTube channel, which has about 3.7 million subscribers today. And you should become one if you like. And we put out about 2 videos a week on different topics in emotional intelligence. So we like to bring our message in lots of different ways and connect with people in lots of different ways as well. But I'd like to talk a little bit now about what it is that we're doing with all of these different ways of talking to people. What are we talking about? What, in other words, is emotional intelligence? This is the really nice formal definition that we tend to use. Emotional intelligence is the quality that enables us to confront with patience, insight, and imagination the many problems that we face in our effective relationship with ourselves and others. And in this case, effective means having to do with emotions. So another way I like to think about this is that we're talking to people about how to navigate around their own emotions more gracefully, more thoughtfully, and also to connect with other people and other people's emotions in a way that's more intelligent, more insightful, and ultimately more likely to make things go well. Now, I know that this might sound a little bit weird to some people. Some people say that's just strange, you know, it's like a little bit of woo-woo magic, whatever. Maybe this is just a fad. But actually, we really think that this is something that everyone understands a little bit intuitively, because we can talk about people we know who have maybe been very successful at things like science, or even maybe they've gotten quite wealthy in a particular area, or they've been a really good lawyer or something, but their personal lives might be a bit sad or a bit lonely. They might have screwed up a major thing with their family or with a relationship, or maybe they're just very unimaginative or a little bit demanding or cruel in a way that's not very helpful to them in the long run. And when this is the case, when someone's clearly very intelligent in one area, but isn't very good at navigating their own emotions or relationships, that person can be said to be lacking in emotional intelligence. So we all have something of an intuitive sense of what it might mean to have emotional intelligence, and unfortunately, sometimes to lack it. But I want to talk a little bit more about what it is concretely that you learn to do when you have emotional intelligence and when you develop it. What exactly are you learning? First of all, a major part of emotional intelligence is some skepticism around our own emotions. In other words, that we're not going to believe everything that we feel right away. We might feel afraid, but we're going to be able to have a little bit of distance and ask, should I be afraid, right? Or, someone can come to us and we can have a bit of skepticism about their emotions. They might be very angry, and we're able to have a little skepticism and say, are they just an obnoxious person that's always angry, or are they really anxious about something right now, and this is covering that over? So we think it's very important to be able to have a little bit of healthy skepticism about why we're having the emotions we're having and why other people are having the emotions they're having. And we know this is a bit countercultural. There are a lot of voices in the world that say, trust your instincts, go with your gut instinct. But at the School of Life, we say, don't trust your instincts. They're often rubbish, right? Not always, but it's good to be able to be skeptical about them. They can lead us very far astray, and probably all of us has seen that in our own lives or in the lives of someone that we know. The other thing that we're very interested in, which is related, and which we talk a lot about at the School of Life, is that we talk a lot about being aware of the way our past might be affecting our current emotional responses. So we say that emotional intelligence involves recognition of the importance of our past and our childhood in particular. You might recognize this if you've ever been to therapy or even read about therapy, because therapists believe this as well. And in particular, they believe that between the ages of about 0 and 6, a lot of our emotional apparatus, our emotional hardware, if you like, is formed. It doesn't mean we can never change it after the age of 6, of course, but it's much, much harder, in the same way that it's much, much harder for someone to learn a language once they're over the age of 20 or so. Our minds are shaped a lot by our childhood, and they're also shaped a lot by our past. If we had a very difficult experience, or even a very good one, that's likely to affect how we see things in the future. And while this isn't ideal for a lot of reasons, the most important thing is that we can become conscious of it. I also know that some people will be skeptical about this. They'll say, that's ridiculous. I have a really nice LinkedIn profile now, and I look very professional and serious, and I'm an adult, and I can manage everything, thank you very much. And I sympathize, because I sometimes feel that way too. But I think we can see a little bit of how our childhood might have affected us when we get in high periods of stress, right? Or sometimes you can even see it when people get drunk. There are moments where we kind of revert back to our inner child. It's a bit like this. This is a child, and this might be his grown-up version of himself, right? You can see this in people a little bit when they're under a lot of pressure. And so the point isn't that we're always going to be acting in very immature ways, but that we have the potential to do so when there's a lot of pressure. And therefore, we need to become aware a little bit more of what those ways of behaving might be. We might have learned as a child that people are not going to be very responsive to our needs, and actually it makes it very difficult for us to work in a team once we're under some stress. So there are things like this about our past that emotionally intelligent people tend to become more aware of and navigate around to some degree. I want to talk now a little bit about how this works in the workplace, right? So why is emotional intelligence important at work? Well, one of the reasons is actually very new. This is a new period in human history in terms of work. It's maybe always been helpful to have emotional intelligence, but never more so than now. And it's probably only going to get more and more important. And one of the reasons is because we're now working so much more with our minds. For most of human history, we were gathering nuts and fruits, and then suddenly we were farming, but that was pretty physical, and maybe then we built some pyramids, and we did a lot of physical labor. But after that, only recently have we started working in really, really complicated teams. Most people have started working in ways that involve talking to people and convincing them and prioritizing and managing their own emotions. All of a sudden, so much of our work is psychological. And so as a result, at the School of Life, we believe that good business requires good psychology. And that this isn't something that's, cute and nice and good to have and maybe the HR team will do every once in a while. It's something that's crucial every single day. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's really, really important because ultimately and increasingly it's going to be the very thing that we work on. Even if our technical skills are great, this will determine whether we succeed or don't do so well at the things that we're working on. Again, it's because we used to be doing things like this, and now, all of a sudden, after thousands and thousands of years, a lot of the most important work in the world, a lot of the work that most of us are doing, looks more like that. And that is very complicated. That involves a lot of guessing, maybe 6 or 7 steps ahead, how other people are likely to respond, how we can persuade them, how we can convince them, how we can get along with them, how we can understand when we're wrong and why. That's very complicated emotional stuff. So suddenly our work is psychological. The quality of the work that we do is now hugely dependent on our emotional states of mind. And as a result, we need to learn with modesty and courage and insight how our emotional minds work and why they so often don't quite. In another way of thinking about this is that the most complicated technologies on Earth don't have anything to do with all the nice things made here at Google. They are the people in this room and out there in the world. We are the most complicated things, and we need to put ourselves, as much as we can, right. We need to make sure it's working. So how do we do that? That's a good question. We'll talk to you a little bit about how we teach emotional intelligence at the School of Life. Some people say, well, what do you mean teaching emotional intelligence? Isn't it just something that you have or you don't have, right? Either you're charming and you're good with people and you're good at communicating and you're calm, or you're not, and it's just what you're born with. That's it. Why am I trying to learn this now, right? But we completely disagree at the School of Life. We actually think these are really concrete skills. You can learn them, you can practice them, and you can get better at them until they become second nature in a way. We'll talk about nature more in a second. And we're not the only people who have believed this in the course of history. Here are some funny people who have definitely believed this. These are French aristocrats in a salon. And people like this were trained for a long period of life to be more charming, better communicators. They learned some funny things, like how to stand behind a chair in a charming way, right? But they also learned how to persuade, how to convince, how to say no without giving offense. And it's really not so much about the concrete skills that they had, because you might need different ones now that you work here. It's the idea that there are things that seem natural, but really took a lot of practice and training to get right. There are things that can make you more likable. There are things that can make you succeed and do better in the world. So we believe what these guys believed in a way. And we also believe what in general is called the classical approach to education, which is in contrast to the romantic approach to education. The romantic approach to education, built on the Romantic movement in the 1800s, says, you know, human nature is wonderful. Let's just have more of it. All the things that humans are already good at, let's develop them and encourage them. But actually, we're very interested in what you might call second nature, the thing you develop afterward. In other words, we're very interested in the types of tools we can use, almost technologies we can use, to improve what otherwise wouldn't be natural for human beings. And theorists of classical education love to use the metaphor of the tool, or in this case, it's a pulley, right? Because no one by nature is fitted to lift a heavy statue like that. That's a statue, actually, that guy. But with the right tools, you can do it. And teaching emotional intelligence is the same way. You can basically develop a new type of nature, a new type of ability that you never had before, and that wouldn't necessarily come natural to you to begin with. So that's what we're working on. Let me tell you a little bit more about how we do that. One of the things that we do, and this is very important when you're working in groups or in entire organizations, is that we help to create a culture of humility. This is really, really important, because otherwise what happens is you bring people into the room and you're like, well, you're the pessimistic one, and you're the problem, and you're the one that's being really difficult, and you're the problem person in our team. And then that person, of course, becomes very defensive, and everyone else feels very self-righteous, and nobody learns anything. So we work very hard to begin by saying, this thing that we're going to learn today, whether it's about communication, whether it's about playfulness, is a problem and an opportunity for every single one of us in this room. All of us have this strange, quirky thing about us that makes it difficult. Or in other words, we are all crazy, right? We're all just nuts, barely holding it together people some days, and all of us need help on this thing. And it's actually really helpful if someone like the CEO can stand up and be like, hello, I'm an idiot. Yes, I'm an idiot in the following ways. And it's good because, first of all, in most companies, at least some people are already thinking that the CEO is a bit of an idiot. But it's actually really reassuring to see someone like a CEO say, you know, I'm aware of my idiocy. It's not escaped me. I'm working on it. And that's true for all of us. We try to create a culture where people can say, I know I have various eccentricities. You know, I don't mean crazy, of course, about mental health. I mean human instability in general. But I'm working on them. I understand them. I know I'm not perfect. That creates a really open culture in a community and in an organization and in a team. So we work very hard in the structure of our workshops and in all the way that we present our materials to say, this is something everyone can work on, nobody's perfect at, and everybody can learn. This really helps us overcome defensiveness. We want people to be open to the idea and actually want to learn and learn new tools that can help them. Another thing that we do, and this is very important, is that we help people not only learn, but repeat, learn over and over and over again, and practice over and over and over again the important skills that we believe in. Because a lot of education in the world tends to think about sort of the human mind as a bucket. Like, you are going to spend maybe a day or a week or a year pouring in some information, and then after a while you've got it, and it's in there, and that's good, and you're done, and nothing else is needed. And at the School of Life, especially around emotional skills, we disagree completely. We think the human mind is really, really fragile. It forgets things really easily. It means well, but it slips. We think we should be kind and generous, and that sounds really great in the moment when you're listening to someone talk to you about it, but then, an hour later you're hungry, and 2 hours later you have an email, and you forget by the end of the day. So we really think the human mind is a bit like a sieve, right? And as a result, we think that we need to repeat everything to do with emotional intelligence quite a bit. We need to practice constantly. We need good reminders. We need interesting, intelligent, sensitive, appealing reminders, because no matter how wonderful we are, it is going to slip through our minds. We are going to need to refresh. We're not the only people that believe this either, by the way. Some of the very first teachers of emotional intelligence, so to speak, however flawed in other ways, were religions, and religions believe this as well. They think that people need to repeat all the time, that they need to be reminded to be kind in the morning, and then after lunch they need to be reminded again because they forgot over the course of lunch, right? It's not because people are bad, they just recognize this about human beings. We need to be reminded constantly, or we're going to get home at the end of the day and snap at our partners and yell at our children. And so we kind of base some of what we do on the structure of movements like this, or meditation, things like that, because we recognize the value of that aspect. The other thing we try to do is just make it interesting and engaging. We work really hard to actually present things in a way that people will say, yeah, that's right, that appeals to me. You can see this a bit in our YouTube channel, of course, which is very popular, but also in the way that we do our workshops. These are some funny slides from our workshops, and they just have really appealing quotes. They have interesting historical facts that you're unlikely to forget, strange art, like that funky art there at the top, good metaphors. The point is we want it to stick in the brain as long as possible before it slides through the sieve. So we're very, very interested in beauty as well. We think beauty brings ideas to life. And that's true, of course, with these little products as well. And all of this is designed, ultimately, to help people be more aware of what they're like. People don't need to be perfect at the end of the day to be emotionally intelligent. What they need to do, most of all, is to be aware of the ways in which they are imperfect, to be able to navigate a little bit better, to acknowledge when they might have screwed up, to look for places where they can improve. That's the ultimate goal. None of us will be perfect, but all of us can be a bit better. This has to do with self-awareness. We encourage all this regular reflection, these exercises. They're all geared in some way towards self-awareness. And rather than go on and on about self-awareness now, I'm actually going to give you a chance to try it out with one of our most popular exercises, the philosophical meditation. So I'd love to encourage you for a minute. It's good to write things down during this exercise, so if you want, you might get out something that you write things down on. It's your phone, or a little notebook or something like that. And I'll explain a little bit about this as well. A lot of traditional meditation, especially the way it's been brought in to the West, has to do with the idea of trying to empty our minds. And in a sense, that can imply that maybe there's not anything that useful to know about the things that are floating around in there. Maybe we don't need to investigate them too much. This is a bit of an overgeneralization. I know there's very complicated different strands of meditation in the East, but the point is that we sometimes lose the thread. We might think, what I need to do to calm down is just not investigate the content of my mind. But at the School of Life, we think it's actually really important. So rather than trying to empty the mind or become more aware of our body, although those things can be useful for people sometimes, we're actually very interested in things like downloading the mind and sorting through the feelings and ideas that we have and interpreting the anxieties and hurts and excitements that might be in there but which we haven't fully recognized and interpreted for ourselves. We're going to get a chance to do that today, at least with one of these sections. Maybe we'll start with anxiety, because my intuition is that most people have anxieties, a lot of anxieties throughout the day. So, first of all, I might say that many people do this a lot. Some people that come to the School of Life end up doing this regularly, maybe for even an hour or so, and it's a good one to take home and try out again. I like to say that our exercises are a bit like IKEA furniture, so you can take them home with you, and then you kind of construct them in a good way for yourself there. But we're just getting a taste now. You're just getting the pieces now. So, these are the usual three questions of philosophical meditation. What am I anxious about? What am I upset about? And what am I excited about? They're just good starting questions. They help us think about what's going on in our life. And I'd love to suggest that we start with this one. What am I presently anxious about? So I would suggest that you write down for a minute or two, as many as you can think of, things that you're anxious about. You can do shorthand so none of your colleagues know what it means. It might just say K, or it might just say 10:30 or something. As much shorthand as you need, and then in a minute, we'll do a little bit more with that list. There's even some suggested categories here at the top, in case you're thinking of things and can't quite drum some up. Work, relationships, family, health, sex, money, things I have to do. Once you've written down a few, you might just choose 3, and the 3 are going to be the ones that you unpack, maybe even 2, since it's a short talk. And you're just going to begin to unpack them a little bit. It's kind of like separating out the different strands of thought that have to do with that topic. So there's a suggestion here of how you might do that. Unpacking anxiety. You might want to complete the following sentences around each of those 2 things. Let's say one of them has to do with an argument that you had with your partner. So you would complete the sentences in regard to that thing. What I'm really afraid will happen is, and you'll think about, is it that you're worried that the relationship is getting worse? Is it that you're worried that there might be a breakup? Is it that you're worried that your needs won't be met? Kind of trying to be as honest with yourself as possible. What is the underlying fear? It's not just that fights are unpleasant, of course. What ultimately might be the bad thing? After that, you might want to consider what you want to do about it. Is there actually something that you could do that would perhaps reduce the anxiety or at least take the issue further in a constructive way? It's good to first figure out what you're afraid of, though. Sometimes people jump right to action, but we need a little bit of skepticism about the emotions before we can choose actions wisely. And finally, you can move on to the point about reassurance. So it's really containment and reassurance, by which we mean that you're not going to let the anxiety take over your whole life and color everything else that's going on. You're going to begin to bring it back down to scale. What is, the limit on this particular anxiety? So the worst thing that can happen is, in some ways, the limit. You might think, okay, absolute worst case, we break up. That would be terrible, but I guess I would do this in that case. I could see my friends more. For some people, this is very reassuring because it contains the problem to a scale that is perhaps smaller than civil war, right? We can also think about how we would cope. That can often be very reassuring. I would take baths. I would see my friends more. I would complain to my parents, whatever it is. These are kind of silly examples, but you probably have your own. So think a little bit about how you might contain your anxiety and maybe offer yourself some reassurance. And then in a minute, if you like, you'll have a chance to just share with the person next to you how this was for you. And if you like, you can share the details. Of course, you don't have to. So in a minute, I'll open it up. When you're ready, do turn to someone next to you and just mention how this was. What did you get out of it? If you like, you can share the details, but you don't have to. And then we'll come back together in a few minutes. I'd love to hear, maybe from just 1 or 2 people, what that was like for you. Was it helpful? What part of it was helpful, if anything was helpful? Or if not, that's okay too. Yeah, I think we've got a mic. Can we bring it over? Thank you. Great.
Hi. I'm actually going to steal this gentleman's point that he made when we were chatting.
Okay.
It was really beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
I took 2 to work on. One was really beneficial.
Yeah.
Because it made me seem like my worries sort of were a bit insignificant and I could just like move past them. But then one went really horrible. So I just thought, in some,
yeah,
when you pick some worries, it can what I'm really afraid will happen is that bit can get a bit horrible. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes. So I think it can work both ways, but I think generally it's like a nice beneficial way to work through it and just be able to sort of like prioritize and work through your worries one by one is a really nice way of looking at it, which I think everyone in this group maybe hadn't done before, so it was nice to do it like that.
Yeah. And perhaps a second issue, there are other ways of thinking about it. So
absolutely.
It's certainly not a cure-all, but nothing really is.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And begin to also look at the nice things that are floating around in your mind but don't get enough attention. So in other words, we're thinking about how sometimes our mind notices things and it really likes them and latches onto them for a minute, but then, it forgets, and by the end of the day you don't remember what it is, and actually you had a nice intuition there, but you might lose it. So these are rather exciting thoughts, or it might be that it's a little bit troubling. Sometimes we envy someone, that's not very comfortable, but nevertheless the envy is telling us something about what we might actually really like to do in the future. So these are areas of excitement, things that give us they're a little bit appealing to us for one reason or another, things we'd really like to get more into in our life perhaps. And we need to learn to identify them more so that we can explore new positive things in our life. So just for a minute, I'd love you to let's think about someone who made you either excited, intrigued, or envious, which are all very interesting words. Someone you thought, oh, their job is really cool, or their way of, talking to me is really appealing, or I'd really like to have something that they have. You don't have to question it too much. You don't have to feel guilty about feeling envious, because the point here is to try to take the thing that they have. It's to try to think about what you yourself might really be attracted to in life. And that can be a really helpful thing to know about yourself. Just for a minute. First things that come to mind, even if it's a bit strange as an exercise. You could also think about really pleasant, interesting, unusual experiences you've had recently. Maybe something that took you by surprise because it was nicer than you thought it would be. That's more comfortable, but I've given you the hard task first. Now the easy task. What was really appealing? What was really nice recently? Once you've written down some of these hints as to your future interests, you might begin to unpack them. So you might think about, well, now that I've met this person, what's something that I might want to explore more or try more or do differently? Or if I wanted to get more experiences like the one that surprised me by being so nice, what might I need to do? The last little section here says plans from excitement. And it's a bit tricky because it's really thinking about what you could concretely do in your life, like little actual attainable steps that you could act on as a result of this excitement. And perhaps the nicest thing to do is maybe talk to the other person next to you, just talk to someone slightly different, and each of you for a few minutes talk about what your plans for your excitement might be. What could you do as a result of this interesting moment that you had? So just for a few minutes, talk to the other person, the other side of you, or slightly switch your partners, and think about what kinds of plans could you make in response to this excitement. Let's share a few, if you don't mind. I'd really love to hear some of your plans from excitement. I can yell more loudly. I used to have a triangle and a gong, but let's come back together, if you don't mind. Yeah. Hello. Does anyone have a plan from excitement that they'd really love to share? Something that came up that you could do? No? A moment that was very exciting? How so shy? Oh, yeah.
I would definitely apply for another internship at Google.
Excellent. What else?
I think it was a little bit of difficulty to define what would be the unusual experience that gets you excited, or a person that gets you extremely excited. Like, to me, there was nothing that's extremely exciting last time that you can't stand yourself kind of excitement.
What about moderately exciting?
But that's the thing. Like, I was only thinking, when I read excitement, I'm thinking of that extreme. And I couldn't remember anything that's in the last year probably. But that does not mean that there weren't probably smaller things. They just wouldn't come to your mind because you never registered them as, oh my God, they're exciting.
It's sometimes hard for us. We lose track of them, right? We often like to say that you should maybe keep a journal, and then the point isn't to say beautiful, elaborate things every sentence. It's to just take note, like, that was quite interesting this morning, before you forget. Otherwise, we have less data available to us effectively. Really, the point here isn't that this is the only thing we do at School of Life. It's rather that it's just one of many, many, many things that we do here, the philosophical meditation. And the point is that, as you mentioned, we have a lot of unthought thoughts and unfelt feelings, and they can elude us, but we need time to reflect on them. Mental good health requires us to constantly download our minds and sort out their contents. And once these things become a little bit easier to identify, the fears and resentments and hopes, then it can be a little bit easier to understand them, and we become calmer and less resentful and clearer ultimately about what we want in life. at this point, I'd love to first of all thank you for coming and sticking with it, even though it's a bit strange. I know some of it. And I'd also love to say that, if you have any questions, I'm now free and I can answer them or take comments too.
So we were just talking.
Yeah.
And I was wondering really, in terms of practicing, you were mentioning that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that excitement meditation, the philosophical meditation, do you think that we should be doing that kind of regularly? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's easy to sit there and go, carry on for 2 years and then go, oh, now I need to reassess my life. But sometimes...
Yeah, I think it's much more useful. I mean, it's nice that we've had a taste of it here, but it's even more useful as you practice it. Just like with Eastern meditation also, right? People get better, quote unquote, at meditating. It becomes more beneficial to them. And in the same way, the more that we start taking note of these little bits of anxiety and excitement and upset and so on, the more likely we are to kind of generate these very long lists we can look through and say, oh, look, these things that have excited me are related to each other, or they're similar. Or I tend to be very excited when I have spontaneous experiences, but I don't let myself do that very much. So the more that we practice it, probably the more we'll get out of it, for sure.
Hi.
Yes.
You briefly touched on this, but I was just wondering what you think about, should this kind of stuff be taught more formally in school? Because I know when I was in school, the focus is entirely academic or athletic. And so only kids who excelled in those things felt good about themselves. Yeah. And there were kids with lots of other talents and that were kind of...
we absolutely think that in the future, we've got a whole section in our blog, actually, in our Book of Life, where we talk about sort of utopia, and we talk about the utopia of education and how much more of our time probably in the education system could be well spent learning some of these things and practicing some of these things. Because first of all, like sieves rather than buckets, we forget a lot of the information that's given to us in school. There are so many things that we just don't remember. But second of all, because information is constantly more and more available to us. But the ability to regulate our own emotions, that takes a lot of time. You've really got to invest in it, and we'd love to see it more widely available, especially to children and young people, but also to older people. We could all learn together, like 70-year-olds and 7-year-olds could be learning this together, actually, maybe in a really useful way.
I get really frustrated when I feel like people don't have any emotional intelligence, because I feel like I've got a lot of it, and I feel like I need that from other people. How would you suggest that I try not to get frustrated in those situations? What advice would you give me for dealing with people that, would see this and they'd be like, I don't want to go to that talk, I'm not interested, or, you try and explain how you feel and they're just not interested because they don't understand it?
Well, first of all, in general about anger at the School of Life and frustration, we tend to say that our anger is equivalent to our expectations, right? If we have very high expectations, probably they're going to be disappointed some of the time, and then our anger will be very intense as well. So frankly, we believe in what we call strategic pessimism, and not just at work, but in general around people. They are going to disappoint quite a bit of the time, and it's actually very helpful to lower our expectations a little bit, to practice. We really like Seneca, who's a philosopher, and he said that you should get up in the morning and have a pre-meditatio, where you think about all the things that could go wrong during the day, and there's a lot of them. And the nice thing isn't that at the end you feel horribly anxious, hopefully, but that over time you realize, okay, well, most of these people didn't go to the emotional intelligence talk and said really ridiculous, emotionally unintelligent things in the meeting, but this person actually said a nice thing. So it allows us to be less angry and perhaps less upset, but also to appreciate more when things do go well. That's a starting point. And also you can give them, secret gift certificates to the School of Life or something, but...
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So, thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
There is this thing called EQ, which is basically IQ test for emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
So what do you think of it as a way of measuring emotional intelligence?
I mean, people have made a lot of tests for this. It's not for me to go and evaluate that particular test. In general, at the School of Life, we like to test a little bit more like taking your pulse. It's a little bit more human-sized, and also people change a lot, and some of these tests might be more credible than other ones. So we tend to think it's more useful if you're thinking about your emotional intelligence rather than if we're telling you from the outside, like, this is your level of emotional intelligence. But we do have little tests and diagnostics you can do for yourself. And that's a bit more, it's less like saying, this is your likelihood of a heart attack. And it's more like saying, why don't you take your pulse? What's your pulse like right now? So that tends to be our approach to diagnostics, I would say. But, it's nice other people are doing other things, I guess.
So you contrasted your approach quite dramatically to regular mindfulness, where you try to suppress or abstract away from emotions and kind of... Can you elaborate a little bit? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in Eastern mindfulness, so I'm going to have to kind of put that enormous bracket around what I'm saying now. Some of the types of meditation that are very common in the West, which have been, through a very complicated process, translated from much older, sometimes religious techniques, tend to allow us to empty our mind in the sense that they don't focus on the content of the worry so much as they ask you to release it. And that can be a very good thing. But one of the reasons we're interested in examining the contents of the mind is our interest in psychology and psychoanalysis and philosophy. I think there's space for both in the world, and one of the ways that there's particularly space for both is that it's important in general to interrogate our anxieties and our excitements, but we can't hold on to them forever. And some of them are not immediately fixable, like global warming. We can all do a little bit, but if we sit all day long thinking about the worst case scenario for global warming, we're going to have a hard time. So I think the goal is to be able to sort out from our anxieties, this one about my relationship where I have some way of learning and understanding more and then doing better, I'm going to really investigate first. And maybe this other one where I can't really do anything, or a more intelligent approach won't make any difference because I don't have the power in that situation, that might be a really good space. And mindfulness, Eastern mindfulness, has a lot of other benefits, which again, I'm not an expert on, but are separate as well. Does that make sense? It's kind of about how much you need to think about the thing to do better at it versus where it won't help.
In the beginning, you mentioned that you recommend to be skeptical of your own emotions and also other people's emotions.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we have to be careful not to dismiss other people's feelings.
Yeah.
Like when someone comes to me and says they're anxious, then I don't want to say, but here's a reason why you shouldn't be anxious.
Sure.
Don't think you're anxious.
Yeah.
So how do you strike the balance between these?
Well, this sounds like it's mostly about other people's, not kind of telling people what they're feeling, which I think is very important. So I think the idea is more to open up possibilities before we choose an action, rather than to tell the other person what they're feeling. Like if a person comes to us and they're very angry at us, it's probably more helpful for us to first ask, maybe some mitigating circumstances, like, oh, this person's under a lot of stress. This allows me to be slightly more patient with them. Or maybe this person is anxious about a thing I haven't even thought about and I don't know about at home. It's not that we then tell them this is the situation, it's that we're almost able to be more curious and ask them and not immediately judge and rush to action. Does that make sense? Yeah. Hello.
Hi. You were mentioning at the beginning of the talk defensiveness.
Defensiveness, yeah.
And I was just wondering if you are dealing with people who are extremely defensive and you can see that it's coming from a place of anxiety or fear, what would you advise to what is the best approach in your opinion?
Oh, I mean, there's lots of different techniques for dealing with defensiveness. The main thing, first of all, is to deal with our own defensiveness. It's very, our school is about changing ourselves more than other people. I think the other thing is to remember that we're defensive because we often think that our value is attached to the criticism the person is making. So we talk a lot in our classes, especially in our classes around work, that we want to make the criticisms as we have them enormously local. Right, so that it's very clear to the person as much as possible that this isn't about their value as a human being or even necessarily whether they're good at their job. It's just this particular paper on line 3, I wonder if we could make it a little bit more X. So one of the things we work on doing is making criticisms very, very local, because the fear of a person who's defensive is that their whole being is being judged. It's also very good to choose the time and place and manner where you give criticism, and sometimes it's easier to give it, out for coffee after you've already had a nice chat, and there's lots of other ways, but that's a good starting point sometimes to make it very local, and to watch it in ourselves too.
I feel a bit like I've seen some of an IKEA catalog. And
Yeah,
I haven't
definitely.
brought
That's
home
what you've
any
seen.
furniture yet.
100%. It's right here.
Could you suggest, what's your next suggested action? Is it like signing up for a class, buying a book?
All those things are good. We like to do things in many different formats. It really depends on what you need. I can also talk to you afterward if you're like, well, this is the thing I'm most interested in. Because we know people benefit from different things depending on what they're facing. I love our workshops and classes. I think they're really interesting because you get to see not just what you're working with, but what other people are thinking about and going through. And that is particularly valuable for me. I really enjoy that. Not yet, but maybe some will be scheduled. And also they happen in our Bloomsbury classroom, so you can kind of go and get a taster of some of our business workshops and also some of our public classes. But yeah, it is. It's an IKEA catalog. The whole School of Life in 40 minutes is tough.
Yeah, I think I was just going to ask a similar question. How can, we talked about individuals, but and also maybe getting our team to be more aware of their own emotional intelligence. Do you do team building
Yep.
exercises along that front?
Yes, some of our are about sort of what does our team need to do in order to do this, or some are quite useful in terms of like allowing the whole group to reflect together and come up with ideas and suggestions together. So yeah, it varies on the topic, of course, how individual versus team built, but yeah.
Just checking the time.
I think it's 57.
Maybe one more question. I see people are starting to leave.
I'll be here after as well, if you have time. Okay, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.